This morning I want to do something a little different. If this is your first time here, if you're a guest with us this morning, know that I don't always preach this way. But I just came back a couple weeks ago from the Selma, from the 50th anniversary celebration of the marches across Selma and Bloody Sunday in particular. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what I experienced there, about what I come back to Valley UU having learned, having changed, and experienced. So there were a lot of celebrations and commemorations going on this particular weekend, March 6th through 9th. One of them was put on by the Unitarian Universalist Living Legacy Project. The Living Legacy Project does things like the Living Legacy Pilgrimage, where they'll take you on, I think it's an 8-day trip through the South, and you get to meet the folks, some of the folks who were there working for civil rights, and you stop at the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham and see a lot of the sites, Edmund Pettus Bridge, many other sites famous from the civil rights movement. That group put on what they called Marching in the Ark of Justice, which was a Unitarian Universalist commemoration of the bridge crossing that included about 500 UUs. They could have, capacity limited them to 500. There could have been, we think, quite a few more. This was my view for a lot of the time. That was in Birmingham. I'm one of the 11 at-large trustees for the Unitarian Universalist Association, and so our board meets once a year, usually off-site somewhere, and of course, it just made a lot of sense to us to meet during this convention. So you'll notice that Larry Ladd was talking in that picture. Larry, if you're listening, I'm telling him that you do a lot of talking. It was fitting that the Unitarian Universalist Association Board of Trustees would meet in Selma. 50 years before, the Unitarian Universalist Board of Trustees was meeting in Boston when they learned of the murder of Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister, by a few locals in what may have been a white supremacist gang in Selma. So after learning of James Reeb's death, the UUA Board of Trustees adjourned its meeting in Boston and flew to Selma to attend the memorial service for James Reeb, which was who was famously eulogized by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. James Reeb's death shocked the country. Some say it took the death of a white minister to do that. Jimmy Lee Jackson had already been killed in Marion, Alabama, which was one of the events that led James Reeb to come. And when James Reeb was killed, people from all over the country came to Selma, leading to the third march across the bridge, actually, which was the big one, in which they made it all the way to Montgomery. One of the important things we did during our meeting in Selma a few weeks ago was to honor James Reeb's family. These pictures, by the way, are taken from an iPhone, so please forgive the quality, but I'll try to help you interpret. This, if you can see, this woman here is James Reeb's, this woman here is James Reeb's granddaughter, right here. And she wore that big smile, daughter rather, I'm sorry. That's James Reeb's daughter. She wore that big smile every time I saw her. They had this whole group right here is James Reeb's family. And they attended event after event. The UUA helped pay for a shuttle just for the Reeb family to get from place to place. And it was a true honor to be in their presence, to hear them talk about their father and grandfather who paid such a price. And they had paid such a price in the civil rights movement. We also honored the families of Jimmy Lee Jackson and Viola Liuzzo. Viola Liuzzo was a Unitarian Universalist layperson who headed to Selma from Detroit and was killed by the KKK while shuttling folks back and forth from that final march. This was, for me, for a church nerd, the highlight of the trip. And there are a few things to explain in this photo. So speaking here, let me go back. Let's just do this manually, Jim. Will you take me back one photo? Thank you. One photo. Oh, now yeah. There we go. Sorry about that. This is Reverend Dr. Bernice King. She is the daughter of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. She delivered a powerful sermon at this service, one of 3 powerful sermons. So let me tell you a little bit about this worship service that lasted 3 hours, which I was just in heaven. It could have lasted 4. This service was a memorial for the martyrs of the movement. So we taught, the Reeb family was there, the Jackson family was there, I think the Liuzzo sisters were there. And there was just a massive crowd packed into Tabernacle Baptist Church in Selma, where so many historic events have been held. Someone told us during that service that the folks lining the tabernacle that morning would have been sheriff's deputies at one point. And now it was folks who were celebrating, commemorating the crossing in Selma. They reserved for us, the UUA Board of Trustees and the staff, a couple rows. Otherwise, we never would have gotten in. And we sat right behind the Reeb family, and beside me sat the UUA treasurer. At one point, Tim put his arm around me and said, "I'm going to watch you and do whatever you do." Because I grew up Pentecostal and felt a connection in that worship service. And Tim sat in the right place. We had fun. We cried together and all that stuff. So Reverend Dr. King here recalled the words of her father, and she challenged us to continue the work. That was the theme. It was not... We got past the memorial service part of the evening pretty quickly and got on to where do we go from here. And that was really what most of this weekend was about. We'll get back to that. Sitting right behind Reverend Dr. King, you see that face there? That is Reverend Dr. Jeremiah Wright. You remember Jeremiah Wright preached what, for my money, is one of the best sermons I've ever heard and gotten tons of trouble for it. Was President Obama's minister for a while. He talked about the Black Lives Matter movement. And he talked about the fact that in the United States, black bodies have always mattered. In slavery, black bodies mattered. And when we were counting people as a half and 3/4 of a person, black bodies mattered. But black lives have not mattered. Again, a powerful sermon. And he was very clear. He was the only preacher who stuck to the 10 minutes that they were requested to deliver. For me, this man, over here with his arm raised, it's hard to see from the back, I'm sure, that's Reverend Dr. William Barber. Has anybody heard of William Barber? He's the director of the North Carolina NAACP. He started the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina. He preached a sermon that has some of the best, to me, some of the finest theological work that I've seen done in a long time. He preached about power in the blood. Now, that's not something that we talk about very often here. We don't sing the old rugged cross in our worship services. But Dr. Barber took that language and recast it. Instead of throwing it out, he recast it, and he talked about the blood of the martyrs. The blood of James Reeb, the blood of Viola Liuzzo, the blood of Jimmy Lee Jackson and Medgar Evers, and all these folks who died unwillingly in the civil rights movement. He talked about the power of their blood calling us to continue the movement toward justice and peace and reconciliation. Just an amazing, amazing man who had the room. At one point, I was afraid people were going to start jumping off the balcony. He had Unitarian Universalists raising their hands, if that tells you anything. Truly, truly an amazing preacher and an amazing, amazing human being. So on the morning of the march, it was a Sunday morning, The UUA trustees and the staff were on our bus, and the buses carrying the other, the 500 folks from the conference were in another place. And we got there early. We were going to try to go to church at Brown Chapel. Brown Chapel was the headquarters of the movement, especially during the marches across the bridge, in part because it's surrounded by project housing, and that was helpful back in the day. But and we knew that the UUA president, Peter Morales, who's going to speak here on April 12th, was speaking at Brown Chapel that morning. So we were excited to get in there and get our place. What we found when we got there ain't no getting in Brown Chapel, not that morning. In fact, you had to have tickets to get in, and we didn't know that. So and by the way, Jesse Jackson spoke there, Al Sharpton spoke there. I mean, it was really sort of the power center, they thought, on that Sunday morning. We found the power center. So we had a camera fella following us. He was filming the UUA board's experience. And we were petrified that the only image he was going to have was this. Us trying to find where we were on our phones and trying to find another church. Finally, we found the Selma Community Church. This is a church that was founded by a group of people, I think a group of people who worship in Denver, came to Selma, their leader came to Selma, was moved by what he saw, and several of them moved to Selma to start a congregation that focused on community activism and work therein in Selma. There were signs from different universities around the walls because people come to that building on spring break and do work. There we learned not about the history of Selma, but about what's going on today in Selma. In fact, they kind of slammed Brown Chapel as that's the place where history is, but this is, I don't know about all that, but we learned that there was a private white school that was started when schools were integrated so that white parents could send their kids away from integrated schools. That school was only integrated less than 10 years ago, that private school, when a young African-American girl, 12 maybe now, she was there in the service and was recognized. There were the minister there talked about threats to white people who moved there to do the work. Phone calls in the middle of the night that sound a lot like the phone calls that Dr. King talked about. We learned that the KKK was active even that morning. While we were there in Selma, a small group of KKK folks, I'm sure, had surrounded a monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest in the cemetery where some kids were going to go protest, and they had thrown rocks through windows wrapped in KKK propaganda. There's a lot to do in Selma and in the South in general. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The march itself, these are my friends Marianne and Karen. The march itself was in some ways a time of reunion and celebration and recommitment. It was a recommitment to join again more fully the work that has been done and we will continue to go on in the name of those folks who shed their blood. There was a lot of singing, of course, as you might imagine. Melissa Harris Perry was broadcasting live. This is rumor. I'm passing on a rumor to you. The rumor is that when the UUs passed in all our yellow, she turned around and said, "I love my Unitarians." She's a Unitarian Universalist, so we got a little shout out from national media, but it was commercial time, which seems to be our luck. There was a mass of people there, just shy of 100,000 people. Official estimates say 70,000. That feels too small to me, but there were a lot of people singing and praying and moving slowly toward and then across the bridge. One of the men, James Reeb, the night that he was beaten, was flanked by two other Unitarian Universalist ministers. One of the men who was with James Reeb the night he was killed is in a wheelchair. When he got to the bridge, he stood up out of his wheelchair and was helped across the bridge sat back down, and went on from there. Powerful, powerful moments happening. It seemed wave after wave of people. Every wave of people who got to the bridge, there was something else powerful like that was happening. The march was slow in part because of all the selfies, too, by the way. And you'll see my selfie in a moment. But it was odd to me to see people get to the Edmund Pettus Bridge and turn around and do that. And in the end, I did it too. This was one of the most powerful moments for me, or it's symbolic of the power. The signs that these women are holding say, "Justice is still blind in Selma. We need help in Selma, Alabama." While we were there was a billboard put up coming into town. Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate war hero, first Grand Wizard of the KKK. And under Nathan Bedford Forrest, charging on his horse, was the quote, "Keep the scare on them." The Edmund Pettus Bridge. Pettus was a Confederate soldier and a Grand Dragon in the KKK. And every day, these folks drive back and forth across this bridge. They pass this billboard. They see the monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest in the cemetery. It's still being lived out in Alabama. This car lot is owned by the only living person who was accused of killing James Reeb. All the folks were acquitted in a trial that was led by a prosecutor who was a segregationist. This man sells most of his cars to African Americans. Complicated state of affairs. Faye Rose Tour, who is a lawyer and an activist, and was at the service at the Tabernacle Baptist Church, said in a newspaper story that the injustice stings for her to this day. She said, "Reverend Reeb did not get a fair trial. His family did not get a fair trial. He was tried by people who were glad he was murdered." So, here's my selfie. What did I leave Selma with? I leave knowing that there's a lot more to do. We need to keep crossing bridges. You know maybe that part of the civil rights, the Voting Rights Act that was passed by these folks in 1965, in part because of their efforts, was recently overturned. There was a lot of talk about that the weekend I was in Selma. The Supreme Court struck down the part of the act that required federal approval for several states and municipalities to change their voting laws. They said it was no longer needed. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her dissent, said that's like throwing away your umbrella because you're not getting wet. There was an undercover investigation that Ginsburg quoted in 2010, an FBI investigation that recorded Alabama legislators speaking to their political allies, calling African Americans aborigines, saying that they didn't want a particular referendum on the ballot because if that referendum got on the ballot, it might increase African American voter turnout. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, "Do you still think we don't need the Voting Rights Act?" William Barber said the Holy Ghost got on Ruth Bader Ginsburg while she was writing her dissent. I don't know about that, maybe. She said in her dissent that in 2001, the mayor and the all-white 5-member board of aldermen in Kilmichael, Mississippi, canceled the town's election after an unprecedented number of African-American candidates announced they were running for office. Under the Voting Rights Act, the Department of Justice required them to hold an election, and the town elected its first black mayor and 3 black aldermen. Immediately after this part of the act was struck down, Texas went to work. Arizona's at work, trying to pass voting laws that make it more difficult for people to vote. We are still crossing the bridge. A Unitarian Universalist minister and author, Mark Morrison Reed, spoke to us one morning. He told the stories of the ministers who decided to go to Selma. And he said, we want to think that most of them went because of these lofty ideals that they had always held, and it was always clear that they would go. But he said, really, it was about relationship. Homer Jack at the UUA knew Dr. King. They had worked together, and when Dr. King said, we need you, Homer Jack said, okay. And then Homer Jack called some of his friends, and people were calling one another, and the Unitarian Universalists reach out to their fellow congregations. And lots of UUs ended up in Selma mainly because of relationship. And Mark Morrison Reed challenged us to think about, with whom are you in relationship? When the call comes for us to work for voting rights, who is it in your circle of connection that's going to call you to go? One minister went to his board in 1965 and said, I don't think I can go. We don't have the money. And one of the board members said, here's your plane ticket. He ended up there. The Hebrew Bible was quoted by Reverend Dr. Barber. It says, your leaders are like rabid wolves who feed on the flesh of the poor. This has happened for a long time. But Selma reminds me of our duty to stand up and be heard as people of moral conscience. The blood of the martyrs continues to call us to that work. The blood of Medgar Evers and Jimmy Lee Jackson, James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, and a lot of others. There's still power in that blood. Let's recommit ourselves now as we sing together. Please stand as you're able and willing. We're going to sing about keeping our eyes on the prize.